occupy the war-torn skies of Europe with Hitler's mighty Luftwaffe. At the dawn of the Second World War, the Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber symbolized the lightning speed of the blitzkrieg attack. A revolution in a new type of aerial warfare, the Stuka rained terror over unprepared armies, but finally met its match at the Battle of Britain. Tonight, fly with the elite airmen of the Third Reich on wings of the Luftwaffe.
In detail, it was much like every other bomber aircraft of its day. Decidedly overbuilt, rugged to a fault, it was as much a product of propaganda as of accomplishment. Nevertheless, it was also highly effective at doing what it was designed to do, attacking and destroying ground targets, including personnel and equipment. In the hands of a competent pilot, it was a decidedly efficient weapon. This is one of the few remaining examples of the bent-wing Ju-87 Stuka. It survives at the Royal Air Force Museum in Hendon and is a testament to the Nazis' ability to produce specific purpose aircraft, like the dive bomber. Hardly an object of beauty, the Ju-87 was purpose-built for its role as a tank of the sky. And when it had sufficient protection, this was a mission it performed well, at least for the first part of the Second World War. Although from 1942 onwards, the type was clearly showing its age. Usually perceived as a weapon of the Luftwaffe, the Ju-87 was used by several other Axis air forces, as they all fought to capitalize on the new techniques of war developed in the 1930s. The central core of the new theory was the concept of blitzkrieg, lightning attack by land supported with intensity from the air. Military theorists envisaged that large numbers of dive bombers, flying in packs, would blast a way through for ground troops, so that the speed of the tanks and armored carriers could be used simply to take the enemy by surprise. German preoccupation with ground attack aircraft did not begin during the pre-World War II 1930s. In fact, support for such military philosophies had its origins during World War I, as exemplified by this AEG bomber, being loaded here with 100-kilogram bombs for an attack against the Allies. World War I ground operations were the worst of all possible nightmares. The conditions were abysmal and attacks came from virtually all quarters with little respite from the air. The effectiveness of such air attacks proved a major revelation to combatants, as not only were they physically debilitating, but psychologically so as well. This lesson didn't go unheeded, and within months of the initial successes, all combatants were operating aircraft optimized for ground attack. The German Air Force was quick to extend its lead in this arena, and many bombers, such as this Gotha GV, were created to fill the ground attack role. The combat successes enjoyed by these aircraft set a precedent for all military airplanes to come. Attack from above, when conducted by surprise, was a most efficient and devastating means of delivering destructive firepower onto a target. If such attacks could be undertaken with even a modicum of accuracy, they could quickly debilitate their target at little or no cost to the attacker. Virtually all combatants, such as, for instance, Italy with their Caproni CA-3, rushed bomber aircraft into production before the cessation of hostilities. Consequent to the development of bombers, there was a newly aroused interest in the development of self-stabilized, free-falling iron bombs. And in an interim attempt to develop smaller, more maneuverable bombing platforms, the ground attack aircraft came to life in the form of such early technology exercises as the Royal Aircraft Factory FE-2. With the cessation of hostilities in 1918, the world's armament factories suddenly found their existence without justification. The aircraft industry and associated military air services were aware of this sagging enthusiasm. Aerial spectaculars, such as the first transatlantic crossing by fixed-wing aircraft with Alcock and Brown in the Vickers-Vimy in 1919, were heartily endorsed because of their public relations value. Similarly, aerial displays such as this, with a multitude of Keystone LB-5 bombers making a formation flyby, were promoted unashamedly in the hope that public support would be forthcoming for the modern US Air Service. Bombs and bombers increased in perceived stature following the successful attack on the retired German battleship Ostfriesland by Lieutenant Colonel Billy Mitchell during July of 1921. There was now no denying the effect of aircraft on the future of military conflict. Bombs and other weapons delivered from the sky offered a virtually unstoppable means of attacking an enemy deep within his own borders. No target was invulnerable, be it a terrestrial structure of concrete or a steel-walled ship at sea. Mitchell's bombers and their undeniable successes had destroyed the myth of battleship invincibility, and likewise the invincibility of all other weapons of warfare. With the advent of the first US aircraft carrier, the Langley, the Navy issued a contract for dedicated carrier aircraft. From these designs, the Naval Aircraft Factory produced a series of successful biplanes. The emphasis was on the dive bombing mission, simply because this produced the most accurate results available at the time. From flying height, even large ships at sea became small targets. By the middle of 1920, a whole series of new biplane aircraft was being developed, and the Curtiss Company of North America was clearly showing the world a lead in producing not only fighters, but accurate dive bombers, which were suitable for carrier use, as defined by the United States Navy. As the decade came to an end, the biplane was still supreme as the single-engined aircraft, although some manufacturers were experimenting with the monoplane concept, an idea that was at odds with the conventions of the time. This proven sturdy biplane was one of the Hawk series produced by Curtiss and lent itself to the accurate dive bomber role. It impressed German World War I ace Ernst Udet to such an extent when he visited America that he arranged to purchase the model, which was sent back to Europe for analysis by German technicians. There is no doubt that Udet was smitten by the Hawk's performance. General Rabach explains.
I think he fell in love with the Curtiss biplane at this time, and he, as we were told, he got one as a gift from the American company, I think, and took it over, and this was our first Stuka.
Although the American Navy pioneered much of the dive bomber research, as time went by, it was to become more interested in other types of aerial attack on surface vessels. Horizontal bombing and the torpedo mission were also under development. And all these methods would require the skill of naval aviators landing on a small patch in the ocean. From data collected on the Hawk, the enthusiastic Udet commissioned German refinements under his responsibility for developing aircraft for the new German Air Force. Under the patronage of Goering, his views were quickly adopted, and soon German production of their own dive bomber became a matter of priority.
Udet was he never should have become general or a military person, because he was the lucky pilot at all, and a very, very good pilot. If you remember the across he did, acrobatics. It was very impressive when he took a handkerchief up with the wingtip.
Certainly, Udet's passion for agile aircraft was reflected in Germany's first dive bomber, the Henschel 123. Effective and durable, the model was considered to be one of the best of its kind. The Arado 95 was another similar plane of the era. Although it flew somewhat later than the Henschel aircraft, it still typified some of the basic features: a large radial engine and fixed undercarriage streamlined by spats. It too had considerable agility and was said to have been very easy to fly, but it was never adopted as a land-based aircraft. However, it did see limited service as a seaplane operating from large German warships. In the end, the land-based version was sold abroad, although surely it must have been considered for its dive-bombing potential in Europe. By the autumn of 1935, the new German Luftwaffe was developing its first monoplane dive bomber. Perceived as a replacement for the 123, the first prototype Ju-87 Stuka was considered a strong hope for the future. Early production began in 1936, though the numbers were limited as the model still required some development, apart from improvements to design and techniques of manufacture. The first Ju-87s were powered by a Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine, there being no better type available of German manufacture. Later, all the production models were powered by Jumo inline engines produced by the 87's manufacturers, Junkers. Over the life of the 87's airframe, its horsepower increased from 600 to 1400. There would also be a learning curve for Luftwaffe pilots to develop new strategies in using this latest type of warplane. The diving attack position would require special skills not previously demanded of aircrew. A great deal of information would have to be gained about flying in attack formations to maximize the 87's hitting power. The Stuka carried one main bomb, and a window was provided so that the pilot could see that it was lowered by a trapeze to clear the propeller's arc before launching. This was peculiar to dive bombers. The 87's cranked wing provided the considerable lift needed by dive bombers, but also assisted the fixed undercarriage by ensuring the propeller was well clear of the ground on takeoff. Large trailing edge flaps, typical of most Junkers models of the time, helped to stabilize the aircraft, especially in the dive mode. They were counterbalanced by weights to reduce pilot effort, since no power assistance was available for aircraft of this type. They ran the entire length of the wing. The Stuka's wing had to be exceptionally strong, first to bear the stress of the aircraft as it pulled out of a screaming dive, and then as the foundation to the fixed undercarriage, where it had to absorb some of the impact of landing. Overall, the Ju-87s were never given the higher level of finish used on fighter aircraft. The rationale was simple. Its mission only required that it operate at relatively low speeds. Therefore, no attempt was made to reduce protrusions, such as these primitive struts and supports with which it was adorned. Even the undercarriage was as basic a device as possible. Leather booting was their only protection against the elements. And the rivets that festooned the wing were never flush with the surface as they would be with a potentially faster aircraft. The other benefit of pragmatism was service in the field. Given the various battlefronts in which it would have to fight, it was important that the aircraft be easily repaired and adaptable to improvisation. There were clever points too. If one wheel strut had been shot away, the remaining gear would make safe landing impossible. To offset this risk, both struts were fitted with a cartridge that would blow the surviving wheel clear. The Stuka was by no means defenseless. Both single and dual-mount machine guns were optional in the rear cockpit facing aft. And though they had their limitations, they did provide a nasty sting. From Poland to Norway, Holland, Belgium, and France, the initial combat forays of the Ju-87 proved extraordinarily successful. Almost overnight, the aircraft became a legend. Its bombs were dropped on targets with stunning accuracy. And the psychological effect its screaming siren had on targeted populations was uncanny. Though Nazi land forces were discovered later to have been at a numerical disadvantage, the Ju-87's ability to offset this proved decisive. Nazi ground forces were spearheaded by Stuka advanced strikes against the enemy. This softening of enemy defenses effectively multiplied the effect of a small land-borne force and gave added credibility to the blitzkrieg form of quick attack. Initially flying unopposed over the European countryside, Ju-87s gained a stature in the Luftwaffe and a reputation among Nazi ground forces that far outstripped the aircraft's actual accomplishments. Though an admittedly precedent-setting bombing platform, it was not, as the Nazis would soon discover, invulnerable. Perhaps the zenith of the Stuka's service was reached during the early stages of World War II, when European skies were controlled by the Luftwaffe, and victories at Dunkirk and over France were inflating Nazi morale. The aircraft had by this time achieved an amazing record for pinpoint accuracy. By the end of the war, it would sink more Allied ships than all other combat aircraft combined, and its effect against tanks would be second only to the Russian Stomovik. Udet's belief in the dive-bombing philosophy and his support for the Ju-87 enhanced his standing with the German High Command. At the beginning of World War II, the Stuka proved an ace card for Hermann Goering and Adolf Hitler. Even Italy's fascist leader Benito Mussolini became enamored of the aircraft, and samples were sent to the Italian Air Force for use in North Africa. France had collapsed. Dunkirk had settled into an historical embarrassment for the British, and the Stuka had seen its most significant success of the war. While Hitler and his Nazi cronies trumpeted the arrival of the Third Reich, the Allies licked their wounds and assessed their tactical options. Undoubtedly, the Stuka epitomized the early success of all blitzkrieg operations. These successes only helped Hitler to consolidate further his hold over the Wehrmacht. Prior to the gains in France, the army had secretly plotted his demise, considering such successes unachievable. But in the light of German victories in the first few months of the Second World War, the rebels within the military fell silent. Party discipline was rigid as Germany savored its success and prepared for total victory in Europe. Until the Battle of Britain, the Ju-87 had operated virtually unopposed. Over land and sea, air cover had been provided by Luftwaffe fighters, and enemy anti-aircraft artillery had been all but neutralized by Nazi land forces. Terminal velocity dives went unhindered, and Stuka pilots were given the privilege of concentration, which was a necessity if a bomb were to be placed accurately on target. The Stuka's successes were dependent on its ability to roll into a near vertical attitude over a target. The centerline bombs, which weighed anywhere from 250 to over 1,000 pounds, were released by a trapeze, which swung down and forced the weapon to clear the propeller disc. Because of G-forces, an automatic dive recovery system was developed, which forced the aircraft to pull up at approximately 1,800 feet, whether the pilot initiated stick action or not. As the British vacated the continent, the Wehrmacht had merely a mopping-up function to perform. It had time to consolidate, time to assess its positions, and time to savor its gains. From now on, Germany would control the order of battle, and it must have seemed to all the world that the German juggernaut was simply irresistible. But there was one target left. The thorn in Hitler's side was England. He had either to treat with the British or annihilate them. The latter course called for Stuka activity. As the Luftwaffe chased the last British and French troops into the sea, they forced them to leave behind vast quantities of weapons and supplies, material the Allies could ill afford to lose, and some of which would even be utilized by the Germans. A pathetic end to the Allied expeditionary force, which should have stopped the Wehrmacht in Belgium. Even before Dunkirk, the German High Command was laying plans for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion and occupation of the British Isles. But first, control of the English Channel and the seas around Britain was necessary. And again, the Luftwaffe was seen as the logical weapon to deny Britain its lifeline to America and its only possible link with survival. Certainly, the British Merchant Marine and the docks that serviced it were the jugular of the last free nation in Europe. Using flying boat reconnaissance planes, the Luftwaffe scoured the British coastal seas, looking for maritime targets. As soon as they were identified, the information was quickly radioed to swarms of Ju-87s, poised to sever the British supply line. In the dark days immediately after Dunkirk, Stukas were able to cause havoc for British shipping. But soon, the dive bomber's superiority was to be challenged, and its weaknesses exposed. The Battle of Britain not only changed the face of the war, but also ended for all time the Stuka's legend of invulnerability. When finally confronted head-on by a determined and well-equipped air force, the Luftwaffe capitulated. And more particularly, the Ju-87 was found to be an extremely vulnerable target. Stuka losses, in fact, were so devastating the type was singled out for its failure and pointedly removed from the Battle of Britain arena. Spitfires and Hurricanes, perhaps the most effective Allied combat aircraft of their day, found the slow and sluggish Ju-87 an easy kill. Once the type's vulnerability and failure over England had soaked in with the Luftwaffe's hierarchy, the Ju-87 was relegated to less intense combat scenarios. This proved a relief to Stuka flight crews, as losses had mounted steadily and morale had declined rapidly.
They bombed quite successfully, but they had terrible losses. Yeah, they were just for the Spitfire, it was nothing. The gun, or the gunner itself, he was not able to get a Spitfire down, and therefore they were drawn back and no more use.
Though the Stuka myth was now debunked, the type remained an integral and critical part of the German war plan. In fact, though successes over England had been minimal, and the aircraft had proved extremely vulnerable to enemy action, production orders for the Stuka had been increased, even as the Battle of Britain rolled to a close. Reassessment of the Stuka's role now led to the conclusion that the aircraft had in fact been more of an adjunct to the old-fashioned gunnery and foot soldier, rather than vice versa. Though the Luftwaffe and its Ju-87s had stunned and confused enemy forces, it was now realized that in fact it was the infantry and the artillery that had secured the conquered lands. The German High Command discounted the Luftwaffe's failure over Britain as it made plans for another front, Russia. In spite of the fact that its bubble of invincibility had been burst, the Ju-87's work was far from over. Its use in North Africa, supporting Kesselring and the Afrika Korps, and in Russia, Yugoslavia, and wherever else the Nazi juggernaut found itself, proved of inestimable value, in what few victories the Nazis would realize from now to the cessation of hostilities. Hans Ulrich Rudel, eventually to become the most famous of the Luftwaffe Stuka pilots, finally logged over 2,500 operational missions in the aircraft, attacking every conceivable target, including a Russian battleship. He destroyed over 500 enemy tanks and was himself shot down at least a dozen times. He flew the Ju-87 until the last few weeks of the war, losing a leg in the process and suffering other debilitating injuries as well. While the Allied forces began their massive build-up to D-Day, German forces attempted to maintain parity and a high level of morale. Though the Battle of Britain had signaled a change in the tide of war, combat remained intense on both sides, and Hitler remained convinced victory was only months away. In North Africa, Kesselring and the Afrika Korps were fighting, without realizing it, to the death with the Allies. Though British forces were meeting with heavy resistance, the arrival of the Americans and the rapid build-up of both manpower and machinery were slowly shifting the advantage to the Allies. In a repetition of the combat situation over Europe, the Ju-87 was having a field day in undefended skies. Within months of the arrival of competent Allied fighters, such as the British Hawker Hurricane and the American Curtiss Warhawk, this success would be neutralized, and Stuka pilots would once again realize their extraordinary vulnerability. Even more frustrating for the Axis powers would be the Allied counterattacks with bombing missions of their own. The Douglas A-20 Havoc, seen wearing British markings, proved devastatingly effective against the Afrika Korps and other fascist forces, which now found themselves as vulnerable as the Allies had been during the early days of the Stuka's combat debut. Once again, the loss of air superiority had shown the Achilles heel of the Ju-87. Allied counterattacks proved stunningly effective and resulted in considerable loss of life and massive destruction of property. Samples of virtually every aircraft in the German and Italian air forces fell victim to the Allied attacks. Many were captured, most simply destroyed. As the war in Africa wound down, Kesselring and his deputies continued to wear a facade of imminent victory. And in Germany, as the war became decidedly more desperate, Hitler also acted out a charade of invincibility, while the world around him was about to collapse in flames and chaos. But there were two small victories still in the offing: Yugoslavia and Greece. In both cases, the tried and tested method of blitzkrieg would be employed. High-speed assault by tracked vehicles, streaming through the towns and villages of rural Yugoslavia, achieved the same results as in Belgium and Holland. The rough Yugoslavian countryside was to provide the cover that protected their particularly tenacious resistance movement that was to form later. But in April 1941, the Wehrmacht, catching the inhabitants by surprise and completely outnumbering them, simply stormed through the country. Again, it was a job for the Stuka. Over 400 of this and similar types were employed in the Yugoslavian campaign. They flew with virtual impunity as the Yugoslavs' humble air force was totally outclassed. In many ways, this was the Stuka's natural element. The steep hills and valleys confined much of the German land transport to established roads and tracks, but the Stukas could pick off otherwise inaccessible targets. Within days, both Yugoslavia and Greece fell to the same proven tactics of blitzkrieg. Both countries suffered the horrors of war as they were transformed into occupied nations. Even the British Expeditionary Force in Greece was pushed back into the sea in an action reminiscent of the defeat at Dunkirk. As always, it was the civilian population that paid the price and inherited the scorched earth that remained. The Greek campaign also involved the Italian Air Force. Some of these aircraft were Italian-built Ju-87s, part of a batch of 600 made by the Breda Company under license. The normal machine gun complement consisted of 2 MG-17s and either a single MG-15 or a single MG-81. The 2 wing-mounted weapons were provided ammunition from wing bays, seen being loaded by the ground crew. The bomb load normally consisted of a single bomb, usually of 550 pounds. Stuka pilots prepare for a mission. Clearly visible on several are the cumbersome flak jackets designed to protect the torso area from ground fire and flak. Italian Air Force Ju-87s depart on a mission. They operated with considerable success until, like their Nazi counterparts, they were discovered to be vulnerable to air interception. Concern for the safety of Ju-87s in the Italian theater was the result of Operation Sea Lion and the associated failure of the Stuka in the English Channel shipping attacks. In fact, the aircraft had not been a complete disaster. Rather, it had succumbed to the relentless pursuit of Hurricanes and Spitfires. Prior to the 87, the Italian Air Force didn't possess a modern dive-bombing capability. The Stuka served to fill a major gap, particularly in supporting ground troop operations. One of the principal problems was that the ill-trained Italian army lacked the ability to cooperate with aerial forces. And what was worse, communication between German and Italian tactical wings barely existed. By the middle of 1941, the Ju-87 should have been undergoing replacement. A much improved twin-engine dive bomber, the Messerschmitt 210 Hornet, had been planned and again personally championed by Ernst Udet. But the 210 was an unmitigated disaster. Not only did it not perform well, but 1,000 were already in production before its failings became apparent. As a result, the 87 was required to soldier on. And even in 1943, when the Germans were starting to produce jet aircraft, no less than 1,000 Stukas left the production line. Completely outdated in design, but nevertheless still able to perform the basic roles. It's a little-known fact that Italian forces also played a major role in the most daring exploit of the Second World War, Operation Barbarossa. It was the biggest single gamble that Hitler was to take, and in that it didn't succeed, it was his biggest mistake. Barbarossa was the code name given for the surprise attack against Russian forces. The cause of much speculation, Hitler's real objective of the conflict, the colonization of Russia and the subjugation of the Russian people, would have given him the room to expand that he'd long insisted was Germany's right. No less than 290 German Stukas were employed, together with 3 million men, 600,000 vehicles, and 7,000 guns. By any standard, the figures are staggering. Even though they were confronted by 4.5 million Russian combat personnel, the shock and speed of the German blitzkrieg worked for the last time. The ensuing battle was the largest in history. The Nazis could claim absolute mastery of the skies, and their ground forces proved no less successful during their initial forays. On the first day alone, the Russian Air Force lost no less than 1,800 aircraft against a German attrition figure of 35. No less than 700 aircraft had been destroyed by Stukas. Although the Luftwaffe also employed other dive bombers, like the twin-engine Ju-88, the fact is most of the early dive bombing work in Barbarossa was carried out by the gull-winged Stuka. A war that Hitler had predicted would be over by Christmas, in fact, was to continue for several bloody years. Years that would see the total demise of the Third Reich. For as the wastelands of Russia and its bitter winter had dismissed Napoleon's army, so too would it Hitler's. This dramatic film gives some indication of the deadly firepower of the Stuka. You can see the tracer bullets fired by the aircraft's machine guns seconds before the main bomb is released. This scenario is reenacted thousands upon thousands of times during the course of the Russian campaign. But by now, all the modifications to improve the 87 and keep it competitive with Allied planes were just about exhausted. The Luftwaffe had even resorted to moving the undercarriage spats to reduce weight and provide for better landing in muddy conditions. Now it was apparent that the Ju-87 was simply too old. Accordingly, several attempts to build and produce a state-of-the-art replacement surfaced, not least of which was the modestly successful Henschel HS-129. Though only slightly faster than its predecessor and not nearly as maneuverable, it nevertheless provided superior protection for its pilot and a more diverse weapon capability. Offering the theoretical safety of two engines, in this case a pair of 700 horsepower Gnome-Rhone 14-cylinder radials, the HS-129 had a maximum speed of 253 miles an hour. It was equipped with two 7.9mm machine guns, two 20mm and one 30mm cannon, and it could also carry an additional load of 4 machine guns and up to 550 pounds of bombs. A devastating payload by any standard, and a combination that was designed to attack Russian tanks, as well as fixed ground positions. The two grooves on the side of the fuselage give an indication of the cannon positions. Initial trials of the type in Russia and North Africa, with mixed results, had little effect on the Luftwaffe's decision to equip additional units with the HS-129. Operational units formed in Tripoli and Tunis and Sardinia, where only a modicum of service was rendered. These aircraft were moved later to the Eastern Front to confront the massive assemblage of Russian armor. The continuing failure of the HS-129 to show any marked improvement over its vaunted predecessor caused the type to quietly disappear from the Luftwaffe inventory. Yet another contender for the honor of replacing the Ju-87 was a derivative of the somewhat unorthodox but nevertheless graceful Focke-Wulf FW-189. Initially unveiled during 1941 as a tactical reconnaissance and army cooperation monoplane, it was referred to as Das Fliegende Auge, or the Flying Eye. With its massive collection of transparencies and its twin-boom tail configuration, it was ideal for the assigned task. A total of 828 FW-189s were built by the end of the war, and these saw service on virtually every front. Heavy use of the type occurred in North Africa and on the Eastern Front. Surprisingly, though giving a strong impression of fragility, the FW-189 was a rugged and resilient aircraft. Its usefulness surpassed all expectations, and it proved a difficult target for Allied combatants to counter. This was due in part to its surprising agility, its ability to absorb considerable punishment, and its modestly effective defensive armament. It was even known to survive the notorious Russian Taran, or ramming attack, sometimes returning to base with as much as half its horizontal and vertical tail surfaces missing. By far the most successful of all the Allied ground attack aircraft was the ubiquitous Ilyushin Stomovik. It was purpose-designed to be a ground attack aircraft of great versatility. It acquired an extraordinary reputation as a tank buster. The Sturmovik was respectfully referred to by the Germans as Black Death, and it was revered by the Russians, who called it the Flying Tank or the Hunchback. Other Allied air forces also came to realize the strong potential of the heavily armored ground attack aircraft. One of the most successful was the British Hawker Typhoon, a tough and massively armed plane that could also perform well in air-to-air combat. In the ground attack role, the Typhoon was deadly, but like the Sturmovik, it was no dive bomber. As far as the European theater was concerned, the title of the single-engine land-based dive bomber belongs almost exclusively to the Stuka. It's true, both the British and Americans converted various fighter aircraft to perform similar missions, but none was dedicated in the same way as the 87. As the war approached its inevitable conclusion, hundreds of examples of Ernst Udet's brainchild would be seen wrecked across the nation. The trend of dive bombing had come and gone in a decade. It had been surpassed by Allied improvements to the bomb sight. This gave American horizontal bombers greater accuracy, accuracy that would leave the heartland of Germany in ruins and spell the demise of the dive bomber concept. A testament to a totally different form of warfare, adapted from an American idea and pursued with a passion by the resurrected Luftwaffe, but only partly proven in concept. The Stuka dive bomber went on to perform other roles of ground attack and tank buster, simply because there was no other plane available. In the end, it was German long-range planning that failed. But on those on the receiving end of the Stuka's deadly dive, or even those who simply heard the scream of its siren, the 87 left an indelible mark. It was a sound they would never forget. Ju-87 Stuka. It survives at the Royal Air Force Museum in Hendon and is a testament to the Nazis' ability to produce specific purpose aircraft, like the dive bomber. Hardly an object of beauty, the Ju-87 was purpose-built for its role as a tank of the sky. And when it had sufficient protection, this was a mission it performed well, at least for the first part of the Second World War. Although from 1942 onwards, the type was clearly showing its age. Usually perceived as a weapon of the Luftwaffe, the Ju-87 was used by several other Axis air forces, as they all fought to capitalize on the new techniques of war developed in the 1930s. The central core of the new theory was the concept of blitzkrieg, lightning attack by land supported with intensity from the air. Military theorists envisaged that large numbers of dive bombers flying in packs, would blast a way through for ground troops, so that the speed of the tanks and armored carriers could be used simply to take the enemy by surprise. Airplanes to come. Attack from above, when conducted by surprise, was a most efficient and devastating means of delivering destructive firepower onto a target. If such attacks could be undertaken with even a modicum of accuracy, they could quickly debilitate their target at little or no cost to the attacker. Virtually all combatants, such as, for instance, Italy with their Caproni CA-3, rushed bomber aircraft into production before the cessation of hostilities. Consequent to the development of bombers, there was a newly aroused interest in the development of self-stabilized, free-falling iron bombs. And in an interim attempt to develop smaller, more maneuverable bombing platforms, the ground attack aircraft came to life in the form of such early technology exercises as the Royal Aircraft Factory FE-2. With the cessation of hostilities in 1918, the world's armament factories suddenly found their existence without justification. The aircraft industry and associated military air services were aware of this sagging enthusiasm. Aerial spectaculars, such as the first transatlantic crossing by fixed-wing aircraft with Alcock and Brown in the Vickers Vimy, German preoccupation with ground attack aircraft did not begin during the pre-World War II 1930s. In fact, support for such military philosophies had its origins during World War I, as exemplified by this AEG bomber, being loaded here with 100-kilogram bombs for an attack against the Allies. World War I ground operations were the worst of all possible nightmares. The conditions were abysmal and attacks came from virtually all quarters with little respite from the air. The effectiveness of such air attacks proved a major revelation to combatants, as not only were they physically debilitating, but psychologically so as well. This lesson didn't go unheeded, and within months of the initial successes, all combatants were operating aircraft optimized for ground attack. The German Air Force was quick to extend its lead in this arena, and many bombers, such as this Gotha GV, were created to fill the ground attack role. The combat successes enjoyed by these aircraft set a precedent for all military.
Tonight, fly the war-torn skies of Europe with Hitler's mighty Luftwaffe. At the dawn of the Second World War, the Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber symbolized the lightning speed of the Blitzkrieg attack. A revolution in a new type of aerial warfare, the Stuka rained terror over unprepared armies, but finally met its match at the Battle of Britain. Tonight, fly with the elite airmen of the Third Reich on wings of the Luftwaffe.
In detail, it was much like every other bomber aircraft of its day. Decidedly overbuilt, rugged to a fault, it was as much a product of propaganda as of accomplishment. Nevertheless, it was also highly effective at doing what it was designed to do, attacking and destroying ground targets, including personnel and equipment. In the hands of a competent pilot, it was a decidedly efficient weapon. This is one of the few remaining examples of the Bentwood 1919 were heartily endorsed because of their public relations value. Similarly, aerial displays such as this, with a multitude of Keystone LB-5 bombers making a formation flyby, were promoted unashamedly in the hope that public support would be forthcoming for the modern U.S. Air Service. Bombs and bombers increased in perceived stature following the successful attack on the retired German battleship Ostfriesland by Lieutenant Colonel Billy Mitchell during July of 1921. There was now no denying the effect of aircraft on the future of military conflict. Bombs and other weapons delivered from the sky offered a virtually unstoppable means of attacking an enemy deep within his own borders. No target was invulnerable, be it a terrestrial structure of concrete or a steel-walled ship at sea. Mitchell's bombers and their undeniable successes had destroyed the myth of battleship invincibility, and likewise the invincibility of all other weapons of warfare. With the advent of the first U.S. aircraft carrier, the Langley,